He had the rope in his hand, but the wild colt refused to move, and for a moment it felt like letting go might cost him more than $5 ever did. The trailer door creaked open as the colt pulled back, hooves scraping dirt, breath sharp in the cold air. He didn't pull harder. He just stood there, frozen, like something unseen was holding him in place. This wasn't about a horse anymore, and whatever it was had been waiting for years. The colt had come early that morning, thin and sharp, slipping over the fields like a blade drawn slow across old skin. Frost clung to the fence rails, to the dead weeds by the gate, to the rusted hinges of the trailer parked beside the barn. The whole farm seemed to be holding its breath. Caleb Turner stood in the gray half-light, with one hand wrapped around the lead rope, the other hanging useless at his side. The colt at the other end of the line was no longer the ragged little creature he had brought home months ago, but he still carried that same hard fire in him. His dark body trembled under the pale dawn, not from weakness, but from resistance. His ears were pinned, his neck tight, his hooves dug into the dirt as if the earth itself had reached up to keep him there. Caleb had loaded cattle in worse weather than this. He had hauled broken machinery, sacks of feed, even a coffin once, years ago, when the churchyard road flooded and nobody else had a truck high enough to make it through. He knew the weight of things that had to be moved, knew better than most that life did not stop to ask whether a man was ready. And still, he could not make himself pull. The colt blew hard through his nostrils, steam rising white in the morning air. Behind him, the trailer door stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow something that did not want to be taken. A few feet more, that was all. Caleb had measured it in his head before sunrise. Just a few feet. But distance had a strange way of growing when the heart turned against it. He eased his grip on the rope, then tightened it again. The colt shifted backward, muscles bunching. Dust and frost mixed beneath his hooves. Caleb could feel the strain in the line, could feel the animal asking him a question he did not want to answer. From the porch, the screen door opened with a soft groan. His sister Ruth stepped out carrying his coat draped over one arm. She did not come all the way down. She stood beneath the eave, watching him the way people watch a man crossing thin ice. "You'll freeze out there," she said. He did not turn. After a moment she came closer and laid the coat across the top rail of the fence. Her slippers darkened with dew. "You don't have to do it this minute." "Yes, I do." His voice came out rough, as if it had been dragged over gravel on its way up. Ruth looked past him to the colt. "You've been saying that for 3 days." The words sat between them. Caleb kept his eyes on the animal, on the narrow stripe of silver-white hair above one dark eye. Even now, after all these months, that mark could stop his breath. It was small, ordinary maybe to anybody else, but not to him. The colt tossed his head once, sharply, and the rope flicked against Caleb's palm. He remembered other mornings, other cold air, other chances to speak before it was too late. A man could live a long while on silence, he had learned, long enough that it started to feel like a kind of shelter, long enough that he forgot silence could harden into something permanent. Ruth must have seen something move across his face, because her voice softened. "Caleb," he swallowed. "He can't stay. That isn't what I meant." For the first time he looked at her. She was older than when she had come back to the farm, though not by many years. Grief had a way of settling into the corners of a person and staying there. She knew that. So did he. The colt stamped once, impatient, then went still again. Not calm, never calm, just waiting. Caleb turned back toward the trailer. The wood floor inside it was scattered with fresh hay. He had laid it there before dawn, careful as a man making a bed for someone leaving home sick. He had checked the latch twice. He had filled the water bucket. He had done every small practical thing, because practical things were easier than the truth. "You found a place for him," Ruth said quietly. "A good one." "He needs more room than this. Better fences. Somebody who knows what to do with him before he breaks himself on my land. That was the sensible version, the one he had repeated until it sounded almost clean. But even as he spoke it, he knew the lie hidden underneath. The colt was not the only one in danger of breaking. A breeze moved through the pasture, carrying the smell of iron-cold soil and old hay. Somewhere beyond the barn, a loose tin sheet tapped softly, again and again, like knuckles against a closed door. Caleb stepped forward. The colt jerked back so hard the rope burned across his hand. For one flashing second, anger rose in him, not at the animal, but at the way his own chest tightened, at the way memory could come alive inside a living body and refuse to be driven out. Then his gaze fell once more to that pale mark on the colt's forehead, and the morning before him slipped, soundless and sudden, into another day entirely. The day dust filled the air, 5 crumpled dollars changed hands, and a half-wild creature looked straight at him with eyes he had no business remembering. The air that day had been thick with heat and indifference, the kind that settled over a place where nothing truly mattered as long as it could be sold. Dust clung to boots, to sleeves, to the edges of men's voices. Caleb had not planned to stop. He had been passing through, nothing more, just another errand, another stretch of road to fill the hours between things he no longer rushed toward. The small gathering sat off a back road, barely marked. A handful of pens thrown together with warped boards and wire. A few men leaned on the rails, trading low talk. No auctioneer's rhythm, no rising excitement, just quiet transactions, quick exchanges, the dull weight of animals being moved from one life to another. He might have kept driving, but then something struck the fence hard enough to echo. Heads turned, not out of concern, but out of habit. Caleb stepped closer without meaning to, drawn by the sound more than the sight. In the far pen, a young colt slammed his shoulder against the boards again, then twisted away, hooves skidding in the dust. The rope around his neck snapped tight as he lunged, his body all angles and tension, his breath coming sharp and fast. "Been at it all morning," one of the men muttered. "Won't settle, won't lead, won't do anything but fight?" Another man gave a short laugh. "Good for nothing but trouble." The colt struck the fence again, not wild in the way of strength, but wild in the way of something cornered too long. His eyes flashed white for a moment as he turned, and Caleb felt something tighten low in his chest. Not fear, not exactly. Recognition. He didn't move closer right away. He stood where he was, watching the animal pace in tight, jagged lines. Every few seconds the colt would stop, head high, ears flicking, as if listening for something that never came. Then the tension would snap again, and he'd circle back into motion. $5, the owner said, noticing Caleb's gaze. "That's all I'm asking. Less than he's worth for meat, but I ain't got the patience for him." Caleb didn't answer. The man shrugged. "Take him or don't. Either way, he's gone by tomorrow." There was nothing unusual in that. Animals moved through places like this every day, bought, sold, forgotten. Caleb had seen it all his life. He had learned early not to look too long at anything that wasn't his responsibility. Still, he stepped closer. The colt had stilled again, sides heaving. For a moment, the dust settled enough that Caleb could see him clearly. Dark coat, lean frame, legs too long for his body. And there, just above the eye, a thin streak of pale hair, almost silver in the sun. Caleb stopped. The world didn't shift. There was no sound, no sudden realization. Just a quiet, inward tightening, like something old and buried had shifted a fraction of an inch closer to the surface. The colt turned his head then, just enough, and their eyes met. It lasted less than a second. The animal jerked away immediately, pulling against the rope, the tension snapping back into motion, but it was enough, more than enough. Caleb reached into his pocket without thinking. The bills were crumpled, worn soft from being handled too many times. He flattened them out against his palm, staring at them, as if they might say something he hadn't yet understood. "You serious?" the man asked when Caleb held them out. "I'll take him." A couple of the others nearby glanced over, then away again. No one argued. No one warned him. There was nothing to warn about that hadn't already been said. The rope was handed to him with little ceremony. The moment it changed hands, the Colt lunged hard, nearly pulling free. Caleb's grip tightened instinctively, his boots shifting in the dust to hold ground. For a brief instant, the animal's strength surged through the line, sharp and immediate. Then it eased, just slightly. Not calm, not even close, but different. Caleb didn't try to lead him right away. He stood there, letting the rope hang between them, feeling the weight of it. The Colt's breath came fast, nostrils flared, ears flicking toward every small sound. Ready to fight, ready to run, ready for something. "You're wasting your money," someone called out, not unkindly. Caleb didn't respond. He was still looking at that pale streak above the Colt's eye, at the way it caught the light. There had been a morning once, years back, when light had fallen across a different face in almost the same way. He had turned away then, said nothing. Let the moment pass because there was always more time. There hadn't been. The Colt jerked the rope again, breaking the memory clean in half. Caleb blinked, the present rushing back in with the heat and the dust and the sound of boots shifting against dry ground. He gathered the line in his hand. "Come on," he said quietly, though he didn't know if the words were meant for the animal or for himself. The Colt resisted at first, planting his feet, pulling back. Caleb didn't drag him, didn't force the step. He just stood there, steady, waiting through the strain until the tension shifted enough for the animal to move a single inch forward, then another, slow, uneven, hard-earned. By the time they reached the trailer, both of them were breathing harder than the short distance should have required. Caleb lifted the gate, the metal groaning under his hands. The Colt balked again, muscles tight, eyes wide. Caleb rested a hand briefly against the wood, feeling the heat of it under the sun. $5. It was nothing. Less than nothing, in the shape his life had taken. But as he stood there with the rope in his hand, and the animal at the other end, he had the strange, unsettling sense that something far larger had already been set in motion. He didn't have the words for it then. He only knew he couldn't walk away. The first night, the Colt did not rest. Caleb heard him long after the house had gone quiet. The sharp, restless movement of hooves against wood, the dull thud of a body testing the limits of a space it did not accept. The small holding pen behind the barn had been patched together years ago, meant for animals that needed watching, not for something that carried this kind of tension in its bones. By morning, the ground inside the pen was torn into uneven grooves. The fence rails dusted with scuffed marks where the Colt had struck them again and again. Caleb stood there with a bucket in his hand, watching. He had seen animals fight before. Some fought out of strength, some out of habit. This was different. The Colt moved like something trying to outrun a feeling it couldn't escape. Every turn was too tight. Every pause too brief. He wasn't testing the fence anymore. He was testing the space inside himself. Caleb stepped closer. The Colt froze for half a breath, then spun away, muscles coiling as if expecting impact. The rope halter shifted against his neck, worn already from a single night of resistance. "I'm not going to chase you," Caleb said, his voice low. The words didn't matter, not yet. He set the bucket down near the fence and stepped back, giving the animal room. The Colt watched him from the far side, sides still heaving, eyes sharp and searching. Suspicion sat deep in him, layered thick over something older, something Caleb couldn't name. He left him like that and went about the rest of the morning. But he came back. Again and again. By midday, the sun had burned the chill out of the air, and the farm settled into its usual rhythm, loose boards creaking, wind pushing through dry grass, the distant hum of a truck passing on the road miles away. Caleb worked where he had to, but his attention kept drifting back to the pen. Each time he returned, the Colt had worn a deeper path into the dirt. Each time, Caleb stayed a little longer. By evening, he dragged a chair out from the porch and set it just beyond the fence. He didn't bring tools, didn't bring a rope, just himself, sitting with his hands resting on his knees, watching the animal move. Ruth appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You planning on sitting there all night?" she asked. "Maybe." She followed his gaze. The Colt had slowed slightly, though the tension hadn't left him. It had only changed shape, settling into smaller, tighter movements. "He hasn't stopped since you brought him back," she said. Caleb nodded. "You could tie him shorter, keep him from wearing himself out." "I could." But he didn't move. Ruth watched him for a moment longer, then leaned against the doorframe. "You didn't bring him here to fix him." Caleb didn't answer. "And you didn't bring him here because you needed more work." That wasn't a question. The Colt paused then, just for a second, his head turning toward the sound of Ruth's voice. The fading light caught the pale streak above his eye, and Caleb felt that same quiet tightening again, sharp enough to pull him out of whatever thoughts he had been avoiding. Ruth saw it. She didn't say anything more. She didn't have to. After a while, she went back inside, the screen door closing softly behind her. The sound echoed in the stillness, leaving Caleb alone with the Colt and the slow descent of evening. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You don't belong here," he said, barely above a whisper. The Colt shifted, ears flicking, but didn't bolt. Not this time. Caleb exhaled slowly. Neither did he. The words came out before he could stop them. Silence followed, heavy but not empty, the kind that waited. He sat there until the light thinned into gray, until the edges of the world softened and the details blurred. The Colt had stopped pacing entirely now, standing near the far side of the pen, watching him in that same guarded way. Caleb didn't move closer, didn't reach out, but he didn't leave either. Days passed like that. He adjusted his work around the Colt without admitting it. Mornings started at the pen. Evenings ended there. He began bringing small things, a handful of hay, a bucket of water placed just within reach. Once even an old blanket he draped over the fence without knowing why. The Colt still resisted, still pulled away from any sudden movement, still struck the ground with sharp, warning force when the distance closed too quickly. But there were moments, brief, almost accidental, when he stood still a second longer than before, moments when he didn't run. Caleb noticed every one of them, not as progress, as permission. Ruth noticed too. "You're wearing yourself thin," she said one night, setting a plate of food beside him where he sat near the fence. He didn't look at it. "You think if you stay long enough, he'll settle," she went on. "But that's not what's happening." Caleb finally turned toward her. "What is happening?" She held his gaze. "You're the one settling, around him." The words landed harder than they should have. Caleb looked back at the Colt. The animal stood in the dim light, quiet now, but not at peace. There was still something tight in the way he held himself, something waiting beneath the surface. Caleb felt it too. Not in the Colt, in himself. He reached into his pocket without thinking, fingers brushing against something small and worn. He didn't take it out, just held it there, hidden in the dark. The Colt shifted his weight, one step forward, then stopped. Caleb's breath caught, not from hope, but from the sudden, unwelcome realization of why that step mattered more than it should. Because it wasn't the Colt he was waiting on. It was something that had never taken a step back toward him at all. It began to surface in pieces, not all at once, not in the barn, not in the open field, Not even in the quiet hours when the Colt stood still enough for Caleb to forget the tension coiled inside him. It came in fragments, small, stubborn things that refused to stay buried. A sound, a pause too long. A memory that didn't fade when it should. One afternoon, Caleb found himself standing inside the house instead of out by the pen. The light through the window had that pale, washed-out look of early fall, the kind that made everything feel thinner than it was. He wasn't sure what had brought him in. He rarely lingered there anymore. The table still sat where it always had. So did the chair. Nothing had moved, but something felt different. He walked to the far cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. It stuck halfway, like it always did. He had meant to fix that once, a long time ago. Inside were things he had not touched in years, not thrown away, not sorted, just left. He reached in and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. The fabric had worn thin at the edges, the color faded to something uncertain. He held it there for a moment before unwrapping it. A carved wooden piece, rough at the corners, uneven lines pressed into the surface by a hand that hadn't yet learned how to shape things cleanly. He knew exactly when it had been made. He also knew exactly when he had stopped looking at it. Outside, the Colt struck the fence once, sharp enough to echo through the boards. Caleb flinched, the sound cutting through the stillness of the room. He stared at the object in his hand, then set it back in the drawer. But not all the way in. He left it half visible, the cloth pulled aside just enough that he wouldn't have to open the drawer again to see it. That evening, he didn't go to the pen right away. Ruth noticed. "You're late," she said from the stove, not looking at him. Caleb nodded once. "Had something to take care of." She turned then, studying him more closely than before. "In the house?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched. Then she set the spoon down and wiped her hands. "You're starting to remember things you didn't want to." It wasn't a question. Caleb leaned against the doorway, his shoulders heavier than they had been that morning. "It's not remembering," he said. "It's things not staying where I left them." Ruth gave a small, tired breath. "That's what remembering is." Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the side of the house. The same dry sound it had made for years. The same rhythm. But now it carried something else with it. Something Caleb couldn't ignore anymore. He stepped past her and out into the yard. The Colt was waiting near the fence. Not pacing, not striking. Just standing there, head slightly lowered, eyes fixed on the space Caleb had just entered. For a moment, neither of them moved. Caleb walked closer, slow enough not to startle him. The distance between them had changed over the past weeks. Not gone, never gone, but thinner, like something worn down over time rather than broken through. He stopped just outside the fence. "You're not him," Caleb said quietly. The Colt didn't react. Not to the words, not to the tone, but something in the stillness shifted. Not in the animal. In Caleb. He exhaled, long and unsteady. "And I'm not who I thought I was back then." The wind moved again, colder now. The truth didn't come as a revelation. It didn't strike like lightning or break him open all at once. It settled slowly, like dust after a long disturbance. He had not brought the Colt home because the animal needed saving. He had brought him home because there had been a moment, years ago, when someone else had needed him to stay. And he hadn't. He had chosen something else. Work. Silence. The belief that time would stretch far enough to hold whatever words were left unsaid. It hadn't. And now, standing in the fading light with a rope in his hand, and a living reminder of that unfinished moment just beyond reach, Caleb understood something he had been avoiding since the day he saw that pale streak in the dust. He wasn't giving the Colt a second chance. He was trying to take one for himself. The realization didn't free him. It tightened everything, because now the question was no longer hidden. Keeping the Colt close, feeding him, watching him, shaping his days around the animal's restless presence. It had felt like care, like responsibility, like something almost good. But if the reason behind it was wrong, then what did that make all of it? The colt shifted his weight, one slow step closer to the fence. Closer than before, Caleb didn't reach out, didn't move at all. He only stood there, feeling the full weight of the choice forming in front of him. Not about the past. That was already done. But about what he would do now, with something that did not belong to that past, no matter how much it resembled it. The sky dimmed further, the last light slipping behind the trees. Caleb's hand tightened briefly on the rope, then loosened. Not fully, not yet, but enough for him to feel the difference. The frost had begun to melt by the time Caleb tried again. Water dripped slowly from the fence posts, darkening the wood in uneven streaks. The ground beneath his boots had softened just enough to hold the imprint of each step, as if the land itself had decided to remember where he stood. The colt watched him the moment he moved. Not with panic this time. Not with that sharp, splintered energy that had once filled every corner of his body. There was still tension there, always would be, but it no longer ruled him. It waited, measured. Caleb stepped toward the trailer, then stopped. The open space behind him, the barn, the pen, the narrow stretch of land he had shaped his days around felt heavier than the task in front of him. He could feel it pressing at his back, asking him to turn around, to close the gate, to pretend the past few weeks had been enough. It would have been easy. He had done harder things by refusing to act. The colt shifted forward first, one step, then another. Not pulled, not forced, just movement, careful, deliberate, almost uncertain in its own right. Caleb felt the rope in his hand slacken slightly. He didn't tighten it, didn't guide it. He let the space remain between them, the line no longer a demand, just a connection. The colt reached the edge of the trailer and stopped, head lifting as he looked into the dark interior. The wooden floor creaked faintly in the wind. The smell of hay drifted out, familiar but not inviting. For a moment it seemed like everything might fall apart again. Caleb could feel it building, that old instinct to hold, to control, to push something forward before it had chosen its own direction. The same instinct that had followed him for years, quiet but constant. He closed his eyes. Not for long. Just enough to let the moment pass without breaking it. When he opened them again, the colt was still there, still waiting. Caleb stepped closer until he stood just beside the animal's shoulder. Close enough now to feel the warmth beneath the coat, the steady rise and fall of breath. Close enough that, months ago, the colt would have bolted without hesitation. Now he didn't. Caleb lifted his hand slowly, giving the colt time to move away if he chose. He didn't. His palm came to rest lightly against the side of the animal's neck. Not firm, not claiming, just contact. The colt tensed for a fraction of a second, then settled. Caleb swallowed. "I kept you here," he said quietly, the words barely more than breath, "for something that wasn't yours to carry." The colt flicked an ear, as if the sound itself mattered more than the meaning. Caleb let his hand fall away. Behind him he could hear the soft creak of the house door. Ruth had stepped out again, though she stayed where she was this time, saying nothing. She understood this wasn't a moment that needed witnesses. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket. The small object was still there. He held it for a moment, feeling its shape without looking, the worn edges, the uneven lines, the weight of something that had once meant everything, then too much, then nothing at all, because he had chosen not to face it. He turned away from the trailer. Ruth watched him cross the yard, her expression unreadable but steady. He passed her without a word and stepped inside the house, the air warmer but no less quiet. The drawer was still open, just as he had left it. Caleb stood there for a long time before placing the carved piece back inside, wrapping it carefully in the cloth. Not hiding it, not pushing it out of sight, just putting it where it belonged. He closed the drawer fully this time. When he stepped back outside, the world hadn't changed. The trailer still waited. The Colt still stood at its edge. But something in Caleb had shifted in a way he couldn't reverse. He walked back to the animal, slower now, without that tight urgency in his chest. The rope hung loose between them. The Colt turned his head slightly as Caleb approached, watching him with that same quiet awareness. Not fear, not trust. Something in between, something real. Caleb took his place beside him again. He didn't speak this time, didn't ask anything. The Colt stepped forward on his own, one hoof onto the wooden floor, then another. The sound echoed softly, hollow but steady. Caleb followed, not leading, just present. When the last hoof settled inside, he reached back and closed the trailer gate. The latch clicked into place with a final, simple sound that carried more weight than any words he might have tried to say. Ruth exhaled from where she stood. Caleb rested his hand briefly against the side of the trailer, feeling the quiet shift of movement inside. The Colt adjusted his stance, then stilled. No struggle, no resistance, just acceptance of the path ahead. Caleb stepped back. For a moment he thought about watching the road, about standing there until the trailer disappeared from view. He didn't. He turned instead, walking past the barn, past the worn fence line, and out toward the far edge of the field where the land opened up into something wider, something unfinished. The air felt different there. Colder, maybe, but clearer. He didn't look back. Not because it didn't matter, but because it finally didn't need to. The path in front of him wasn't easier, it wasn't certain, but it was his. And for the first time in a long while, he stepped forward without carrying something that didn't belong to him anymore. Sometimes what we hold on to isn't love, it's fear of letting go. This story reminds us that real strength isn't in keeping something forever, but in knowing when to release it with honesty. If this moment spoke to you, stay with us, because the next story might reveal something your heart has been holding on to, too.
If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Horse Heart Healing for more stories like this.